Hey everybody, I'm Kostas.
Hi, I'm Lester, and welcome to another episode of What's with RWE. And this is actually our year-end recap. Actually, it's going to be one of our holiday specials as well. And this is the first time we've actually done this in person,
Yeah,
live.
this is actually pretty exciting. We have our lovely fireplace or pseudo fireplace fired up in the back here, and even though it doesn't look like it, today is a pretty cold day outside. So anything that looks this warm actually helps. You're in Montreal.
Absolutely, especially coming from a guy that's from Vancouver. I am freezing. So we're going to do something like slightly different than our usual episodes, but it's actually similar to what we did last year, but now in person. So we're going to actually highlight a couple of clips that we have from this full year, just highlight a couple of clips based on some criteria that we've sort of set. So maybe let's start things off with one of those clips. But actually, do you have anything you wanted to jump in and say, Costas, before we jump into sort of the segment?
Look, I think I'll start off just by saying it's been a tremendous year for our little podcast here. The people that we've had on, I don't know about our viewers, but it's been an exciting year. It's been great to talk to a lot of different individuals, not just even focusing on RWE anymore, but really broadening out and looking at the healthcare system writ large. So how do we pull the big levers to make changes? Our focus has always been on oncology, and it continues to be so for now. But it takes a lot to turn a ship of this size of the healthcare system, and I think the people that we've had on have that large scale in mind. I think for me, that's been an exciting year to talk to all the different types of people that have an influence on what the healthcare system is going to be like.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's been just incredible. Just thank you again to all the guests I've been on. And, if we didn't highlight a clip from yourself who were on the podcast, we apologize in advance, but there's only so much time here. I'm sure we're going to have another conversation, hopefully, in the coming year as well. So maybe we start off with the first one. So, Costas, what was a moment that made you think differently? Which guest brought a moment to you that made you think differently?
Well, I think one of the guests who is a good friend here to not only the show but to Exactus as well, Eva Villalba, who is a big advocate for looking at the value that is provided by the healthcare system in a different way. I think her reference was that you really have to be almost a Jedi to apply some of these new tactics and new perspectives. And for me, it was the clip I think that encapsulated it was less ribbon cutting and healthier people. So in other words, let's actually take a look at what drives change in the healthcare system that can improve health in people. So not just looking for, inputs and outputs, but actually taking a look at what does healthy mean and actually putting the inputs in that actually maximize that. And so for me, using that Jedi Star Wars sort of theme, for me, that's the concept is a new hope, for Canadians, and really trying to match what's expected by patients to how we're trying to achieve it. And I think for me, that was one of the really big, let's think differently about healthcare in Canada moments. And so, yeah, for me, that's definitely my top one there. How about yourself?
Yeah, for me, sorry, I gotta play around the microphone and mute myself here, but for me, it was one that may be quite esoteric for the audience, but I actually really enjoyed it. It was with Tyler Meredith, and Tyler was he was the senior economic advisor to the Liberal government and the Liberal federal government of Canada, and the one specifically was around this idea that you really have to advocate for cancer care to be a top priority for the country, because the federal budget process, which I had maybe a very different view of. I thought, for instance, naively perhaps, that the goal of the healthcare budget is to improve clinical outcomes. And he helped me understand that, at least helped me understand that actually the budgeting process is not that it's purely specifically around, oh, how much do we have in terms of money, and how much we're going to allocate to healthcare, and then how much are we going to spend based on all these line items. What can we make work? So that was very, very interesting to me. But it makes a lot of sense. And it completely makes a lot of sense. And because of the fact that right now there's so many obviously challenges in from a healthcare perspective, that cancer care is just not something necessarily that's always on everyone's top of mind. So it's something that we absolutely need to do from our advocacy perspective, is really go out there and make sure that that's still something that people want to, of course, spend effort on, right?
The people who should see it, though, are the health system administrators. So
Yep.
the ministries of health and the bureaucrats that have been managing the financial resources to make it work for a very long time. Doctors may be persuaded by data. Are these administrators equally persuaded by data, or is there something else that we need? So do we need patients to be going to them and saying, listen, we've had enough. What you're doing today is not enough for us.
Absolutely. And I think that that's why patient advocates in Canada have been leading the value based healthcare transformation, because we're demanding it on behalf of the patients that we represent. And when it comes to politics, I don't think politics are good or bad. I think it's like the force. And I try to be a Jedi, you know. You don't always see are the dark Sith lords, but actually if we actually influence politicians by telling them, look, this is what your citizens want and need, and this will make you look good. So, you get to do good and look good, and ultimately everyone wins. Let's go in that direction because, and that's why we have to tie in those economic arguments. That's why we need to tie in, like, this is what people need and this is why. Because the metrics that they're used to using are obsolete. I don't think that they serve our needs anymore.
Yeah.
That's what we had because it was the best that we had. Fine. But we're in 2024 now. Let's get with the times. Our IT systems are also getting better and hopefully they will continue to get better. So we can do things now that we couldn't do before, but we really need to kind of rattle them a little to make the decisions that are best for the population. And the only reason that they will do that is if they're incentivized by real patient stories, real communities getting together and saying, hey, it's not enough to give us the cheapest thing, or it's not enough. Like, we don't want austerity measures. We're all traumatized all across the country on austerity measures in the healthcare. So how can we actually do better, not have to send our cancer patients to the United States, like in British Columbia, for example, or at one point we had to do that in Quebec too. How do we actually deliver the best to our population within our capacity to pay, and then showing the population that what we're investing in actually makes them better, And I think what we're missing too is like more investment in primary care and early detection and screening, demonstrating that that's really much better for patients and families, but it's also better for the system because we know it theoretically, but we've never done that. I mean, we saw during the pandemic how underfunded public health was. And so I think that, flipping that model right now, the pyramid, of our investment is like we spent the most in hospital care, then a little bit in chronic care, and so little in primary care, right? But if we what we need, what the patient population needs or the community needs is more in prevention than medium level in chronic care and maintenance, and then only a little bit in acute care, because ideally less people would have to get there because we did such a good job preventing things in advance. And so that's also a mind shift. Like, what do we spend money on? But politically, it's more sexy to build big hospitals and buy MRI machines than to spend a lot of money in prevention that takes years and years to show results. But we'll never know if we don't measure. And so you can only improve what you measure. That's where we got to start.
So what I hear is less ribbon cutting and
Yeah.
more healthy people.
Exactly. And you know what?
Really
Show me the data. Show me the data. Like, show me that people are doing better. Like, hold me accountable for a healthier population. let's lower mortality. Let's improve the lives of people that have chronic disease. Let's take deadly cancers, make them chronic, and then chronic and make them curable, you know. But show me the data, and let's judge our politicians based on how healthy they make their population, and not just the ribbon cutting ceremonies.
So it's interesting to understand the process within that year, and it doesn't sound too dissimilar to how a business would operate throughout the course of the year, setting its goals for the next year and creating that budget to meet them. I think one of the things that maybe makes it a little bit different is, and it would be helpful for people to understand, is who's involved in the decision making process, because I think that's the other part of the black box. Everybody just assumes somehow budget day, everything gets there, and the Minister of Finance has figured it all out, and that's it. But that's clearly not the way it's done. So who's in the room? Who's actually helping guide that process?
I think it's important to distinguish that we're talking in all of this about the budget process, which is setting the direction about how we raise and how we allocate money, right?
Yeah.
But what that budget process doesn't do is actually how we spend money. That's a whole other separate process, and we can talk about that in a second. But I just want to emphasize that those are distinct things, because the people who are involved in one are not the same people who are involved in the other. So the people who are involved in the budget making process are in both the provincial and the federal context. They vary a little bit the degree to which who has final say, but more or less the processes are the same federally and provincially. And they involve really two key decision makers. In the federal context, it's the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister. In the provincial context, it's the Premier and the respective Finance Minister. And in all cases, the Premier or the Prime Minister has the final prerogative of what we call funding authority, where if they have a disagreement with their Finance Minister, they have the prerogative to override the Minister's decision and to say, well, maybe you don't want to fund it that way or to that degree. I, however, have a broader responsibility to the government, to the party, and to the caucus of our governing party to think more broadly than just a finance minister. Because remember, the things that a finance minister largely has to worry about are not the same things that all their other colleagues have to worry about, right? Finance minister has to ensure that there's some degree of credibility and prudence associated with their plan over a 1 to 3 to 5 year cycle. They've got to hopefully maintain that credibility with rating agencies, and we've seen a couple of provinces have their credit rating downgraded, and in Ontario's case actually upgraded recently, and that has an effect obviously on the cost of borrowing if they're going to go into the market and borrow money. But they also have to manage the internal dynamics with their colleagues about, okay, maybe we're not going to invest in something today because it's not ready, or I can't deal with this priority right now because it's too big of a funding ask relative to what my fiscal objectives are, right? And the Prime Minister may disagree with that assessment that the Finance Minister has made, because they may say, well, yes, I understand why you as the Finance Minister have to care about the fiscal framework, but at the end of the day, the government has a broader set of objectives. So it's effectively those two people ultimately individually making a decision or a call on each one of those 300 decisions that I mentioned. And underneath them are their respective political staff, who each give their own advice to their specific principles about each individual decision. And underneath them are the officials within the respective finance minister's office, finance department, or Privy Council or Cabinet Office, which supports the Premier or the Prime Minister. And so if you think about a funding decision, you will have a request that comes in from an individual minister, let's say the Minister of Health. They ask for a series of things. Then that gets turned into a decision note that a public servant in the Department of Finance will generate, giving their analysis on that particular request and how it fits in the budget process objectives that have been set out initially. That goes up to a deputy minister who then signs off on that advice. It goes to the finance minister's office, who gives their political advice on top of the public service advice. Then a decision is made by the minister, taking in both of those pieces of advice. And remember that as this process is unfolding, the minister who's requested that money, the health minister, for example, doesn't know about anything that's going on in this process. They've made their pitch, but they're just like a stakeholder, like anyone else. They're removed from this process. They don't get a say in this process, right? So they're like the Canadian Medical Association on the outside looking in. They've made their ask and they're hoping that the process goes. And they may be exercising a degree of influence, trying to talk to people and encourage people and try to get people on side as part of coalition making. But even though they're in cabinet, they're not part of this decision. And so once the finance minister makes their decision, that gets transmitted over to PMO or the cabinet office. And then a similar process as happened on the finance side, as it goes through public service to political staff to principal, that same process happens simultaneously then on the premier's office or the prime minister's office side. And so you effectively have two decision makers with their individual sets of advisors providing input, but it's those key decision makers who get the call. It's not the other folks in the system. And so sometimes on budget day, when a decision gets announced, you also as much have to deal with the external stakeholders as the internal stakeholders. The people who asked for a bunch of things didn't get what they wanted, and they may be just as cranky even though they're actually all on the same team.
Yes,
for sure.
And actually, I was gonna. Eva's was kind of a second one for me, so I'm glad we picked slightly something different there. So maybe on to the next one.
Mm-hmm.
So, what was a topic that made you sort of want to dive in more and have a deeper conversation about?
So, it's funny, your number one or what made you think different was Tyler's discussion. And for me, the topic that I want to explore further actually came from our discussion with Tyler as well. So, and it was around, I think, a question that you had asked, just a clarification on, how does Canada invest? Isn't it an investment to, do you look at just costs and allocate until you have no more money? Or do you think about it from an investment perspective? So you're putting money in and you expect that long term there's going to be some sort of a benefit, right? So for me, that discussion was really important because he highlighted how risk averse our government budgeting is, how very limited the time frame for, let's say, returns are, or non-existent. That was, for me, I think, a bit of a surprise. I had expected that the government would always be thinking, okay, if I'm investing extra dollars here, there's got to be some sort of return on our investment. And the fact that that's not the way that it's considered for the most part, and I think there's always exceptions, but for the most part, it really comes down to, let's say, a little bit more political calculus, with different voices pulling for money, but not really using investment and value as the sort of the litmus test for who should get a little bit more or less. And for me, the interesting thing here is we have an entire ministry, the Innovation, Science, and Economic Development portfolio, that is tasked with trying to figure out, if we invest, what do you get out of it? And I think for the most part, the short term is, do we get some jobs? Are people paid to do work at some point? Which I'm not sure that that's the right way to look at federal investment, especially into R&D, especially in the life sciences. I think we have a very specific perspective, and I think that not only can you deliver healthcare, but I think you can support a very robust life science industry at the same time. And I see those two linked, and it doesn't sound like those two are. So for me, I think there needs to be additional thought about, are our policies really thinking long-term enough and big enough, or are they just super siloed? They're just really meant as payoffs to particular constituencies. I was a little bit disheartened to hear it, but I think that more thought needs to go into, how do we invest our scarce dollars, especially around healthcare.
Yeah, no, I think that was really absolutely very interesting. And the thing for me around that I maybe learned from that specific conversation around that topic was that it's not that it wasn't malicious that they tried to do it this way. It was very much around this idea that they didn't want to. It's almost like overly conservative, actually, being overly conservative with the numbers, so that, hey, we don't want to project something that's so much further in the future that, oh, we basically balance the budget because we project that this is an investment, actually, and will reduce all these costs and bring in all these dollars as well. But I completely understand where you're coming from, and if we are obviously running into a, not just ourselves, others in the world, a fiscal wall, that we need to think maybe more deeply about that. And part of that is, like you suggested, how do we do that? Completely makes sense. Maybe we need our own Doge, Department of Government Efficiency in some ways, but maybe it won't be government efficiency. In this case, it'll be how do we just link things together, right?
I agree. It's like I said, it's not done out of maliciousness. It's just the way we have done things traditionally in Canada, and we're just not really willing to make big changes um, without taking a very long time to get there. So we're just not as agile, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, compared to some other market economies. Yeah.
Actually, so I'm gonna change things on the fly because I actually had Eva on as the my one topic that may want to explore more, which was value-based care. But I'm gonna change it on the fly so that we can highlight another guest. And I would say the one with Shirin, specifically around AI and healthcare, is something that I do want to dive into further. Maybe less so from the perspective of the new innovations, like her innovation. She talked about her innovations around new imaging tools and new capabilities that her lab is developing. But she really talked about this potential need for pan-Canadian data. So we didn't dive into that maybe deep enough, but maybe a topic that would be interesting would be this AI in healthcare, but also what is the 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 elements or the components that fuel that to make Canada, back to your investment conversation, what would change it so that Canada is a leader in something as opposed to, just being an at like a Me Too type of country? What can we do to really accelerate something to make Canada the leader in a particular space around AI and healthcare? So I would say that was a topic that I would like to dive into further.
Yeah, that was pretty high on my list as well. That question of, we've put $2 billion into investing in AI, for example, but what are we buying? We're buying compute, we're buying GPUs, which is fine if you're behind and you need something to invest in. That's certainly one place, but again, I think it goes back to policy for what's going to be the long term, the best investment. Is it just infrastructure, so technology, or is it generating IP out of whether data, for example, creating something that from a long term perspective will actually return on that investment? And I think that's, again, I think both are important when you are starting from behind and you have not made those investments. And certainly for us, we've always pushed on the data piece as the enabler for creating that long-term IP. So it was definitely top of my list as well. So I think that's a good one to call back to.
And a couple of things that you do, and which I really like in different podcasts and also on different articles, is you use something quite novel. You use facts and statistics, actually, as opposed to just complete hearsay, right? So, and one thing that you had mentioned that was very interesting to me was, that when a budget line item is put together, it is a cost, right? It is actually not thought of as an investment. That is not really in the way that the budget is put together. Like, hey, you know what? If we put together, let's say, a rail network, right? That most people would consider that investment, right? Because you should recoup some ROI over time, right? But that is actually not how it's done from the federal budgeting side of things, right? And what I've been thinking about when you had this, we're having this conversation, is some things that, for instance, impact healthcare is like not enough, let's say, skilled labor, right, for those specific positions, and that would be probably in the purview of someone else, like the immigration minister, or another department. I'm sure there's many departments to solve this healthcare problem. Is not just in the healthcare like space. So how do you square that circle? How do you solve a problem that actually involves multiple departments?
Yeah. So let's start with the investment point that you made a second ago, because I think that's critical for people to understand. Um, in if as Costa was saying, there is a set of financial statements that a company would put together that you would be familiar with. And if you were preparing financial statements for a publicly traded company, you would be giving a forecast of what you think based on a series of capital expenditures you might make in order to grow your business. You think what that will return to you in terms of forecasted future sales, right? And so you have a forecast based on, I do X as an investment. I'm going to generally, I should produce Y as outcomes, right? And I would be required to give guidance, right, about what I think the results of those investments are going to be. In in the accounting system that we use in the public sector, for reasons that are both good and bad, we can't do that. So we can't think about the second order effects associated with an investment. So if, for example, we're trying to make a case that says that an investment in childcare is going to improve economic growth because it will result in a higher labor force participation of women, which will raise their income, which will increase aggregate income in the economy, we have to take that. We can only take the first order effect, which is the investment of the upfront cost and the cost to government of the expenditure, but we can't necessarily build into the forecast an assumption of improved growth in the baseline. Similarly, if we were making an investment in the healthcare system because we wanted to, for example, improve cancer screening, and we believe that may have a knock-on effect in reducing use of much higher intensive interventions later on and higher cost interventions later on in life, we can't book any savings from those things, right? So in effect, the policymaker, especially if it's a finance minister, has to buy into these ideas simply on the basis of whether they believe it's a good use of money, believing that maybe it will pay off in the future, but not having a fiscal framework that allows them the benefit of any of those payoffs down the road, right? And part of the reason why we do it this way is because we don't want it to become this banana system where, and you see a little bit of this in the United States, where you can play with a bunch of assumptions underneath the hood of the budget, and you can rescore things and assume very generous expectations and elasticities associated with second order and third order effects. But at the end of the day, if those don't come to pass, it won't matter because it'll be years from now and nobody will know the difference. But it leads to bad budgeting and poor discipline in fiscal policy. That is probably a very relevant and very good concern to be organizing our accounting system around. But it probably also leads to an excessive risk aversion in the other direction. And so in some cases, as I say, we are avoiding making the more productive long-term investments, whether it's to address things like climate change, whether it's to build housing because that's actually becoming a cost to productivity, whether it's how we address long-term investments in the healthcare system that shift from care to prevention. We are in effect stymied from making those decisions because we have a fiscal framework which organizes how we make budget decisions that doesn't encourage policymakers to take those risks.
So maybe if you could maybe walk people through a little bit about your scientific process or your scientific approach and how you deploy artificial intelligence or AI, or like how do you decide when to use what? It's because it's such a blanket term, it's such a hot topic right now. People may be thinking, hey, what you're doing is akin to what Meta is doing, right? Or akin to what Google is trying to do, which is like sell more ads or sell more things to the person, right? That they have captured the data about. Like maybe you can walk people through like what does a scientist do? What is the day in the life of Shirin from a scientific perspective?
Yeah. So obviously I do other things than AI. So what I do is actually to guide a very large team of young researchers. So I myself nowadays do not do any science. I come up with ideas and I mentor and guide graduate students and postdoctoral fellows to do research. So they are sitting now in their offices and doing research while I'm sitting here speaking with you. So my role is to teach, to supervise, to come up with ideas, to write grants. So I have to find money to pay for all this amazingly smart young people that can conduct research. So most of my time goes to writing grants. And what type of questions or what type of unmet needs are we solving right now or addressing? And it is for example, as I told you, in at least in the oncology, we've claimed for a very long time that we offer personalized treatment to each patient, which is not true. When we have a patient coming in, depending on a cancer site, stage of cancer, and so on, we offer a certain treatment. The oncologist follows a protocol, which means that they offer a certain treatment, certain dosage, and so on. So all the patients under this umbrella get the same treatment, um, while every single of this patient is different. So this is an unmet need for me. So every single patient that comes in should be given a specific tailored treatment for that specific patient. And I'm hoping by having this very multimodal data for each of the patients that we have in the future, we will be able to tailor treatments that are very specific for that specific patient. So that is one project. Other projects are, for example, we are working with GI department at the hospital. They have a very long waiting times for colonoscopy, and we are working to triage patients. So based on many clinical inputs, to be able to triage patients to colonoscopy. So those who are not have a very acute disease, they can wait, and those who have a very acute disease, they can be fast forwarded to colonoscopy. So we are helping, for example, with waiting times in this. So triaging patients, we use AI for that. We are helping dermatologists to predict melanoma. We are doing so many different projects. We are helping to segment in radiation oncology, for example, the tumors need to be segmented by radiation oncologists, the organs at risk, and all of them are done manually on patients' CT or MRI images. We are helping to do the segmentation with AI, which becomes automatic. There are many commercial solutions already existing for AI-based segmentation. However, they are not trained on the populations of patients that we have. So some of them, they are actually not doing very well. And in-house model are working much better because they are trained on our own populations. And this again tells you a lot about the diversity of data. For example, right now we just submitted a paper for our pediatric patients. So the segmentation, I don't want to mention any commercial companies, but the commercial solutions that we have now are trained on an adult population. They do not do well on children. So we had to write our own model trained on our own pediatric population. So every single day we have a new question and new problems to solve, and it's very exciting.
Awesome.
So I think the next thing we wanted to look at was the questions that we had wished we asked some of the members, and why we thought it was going to be important. So maybe we'll why don't you kick that one off for me so I don't steal any of yours again.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that. It's this way I don't have to think on the fly on that one and try to remember all the conversations we had, because we had so many great conversations with guests. So the one that I'm going to go with is with Joan. So Joan is a patient advocate for pulmonary hypertension. Is it hypertension? Yeah, PHA. Yes, Pulmonary Hypertension Association of Canada. And for herself, what I really wanted to maybe ask, and I didn't really get a chance to ask, was so obviously Joan, her daughter is suffering from PH, PH, and what I would have liked to ask her was what type of measures would she like to probably have seen from a caregiver perspective. So we talked a lot about from a patient perspective. For instance, one of the clips that we'll link to, well not link to, we'll show right after this, is that she talked about how real world data is really important and real evidence really important from a patient perspective. And I wanted to know what type of data would have been interesting from a caregiver perspective. And what I mean by that is what type of measures you get from a caregiver, because in many ways these very, very challenging diseases affect the family just as much as maybe not just as much, but it affects the family very, very, very deeply as well. So I would say that was something I wish we dived deeper into, but I didn't get a chance to. We'll probably bring her back on and actually just have that conversation.
One thread that I want to pull on, primarily because we actually on our previous guest talked about this idea of a diagnostic odyssey. And she was Catalina in our last podcast. She has cancer, but that's a slightly different. That's different. And she said that her diagnosis made her understand just a little bit more about the diagnostic odyssey that rare disease patients go through. So, actually, do you mind educating, at least giving the audience a almost a glimpse into what that diagnostic odyssey looked like for your daughter?
Yeah, and I can. And actually, she was quite lucky. She was diagnosed with a rare disease at the age of 24. But it's incredible, really, when we look at where we are in relation to so many other patients, not only just in our community, but in the rare disease community, about where we live, about how quickly she was diagnosed. I mean, we live in just outside of Toronto, so we have access to the best hospitals in Canada. She was diagnosed really quickly. There are medicines to treat the disease. It doesn't cure it, like I said before, but it does slow the progression, which gives us time to actually hope for new medications that will reverse the disease. But I'll give you I'll explain how she was diagnosed. She literally she was walking down the street on the day I think it was the Vancouver the gold medal game of the men's hockey day, February. I can't even remember the date, but it was February 2014. She literally stopped breathing. She couldn't. It was cold. It was really cold outside, and cold obviously restricts your breathing anyway. She literally. I mean, we always say, "Oh, I can't breathe," and she couldn't breathe. And so she does work at a hospital in Brampton, and she just figured she would go into the hospital and she would ask. She figured they would say if she had asthma and she'd get an inhaler. And when she went into the hospital, and she went into emergency, and they literally admitted her for 10 days onto the cardiac floor. So her diagnosis, but that's what I mean. We had seen stuff before. We just assumed it was because she wasn't as active and her cardiovascular system wasn't as good as it was when she was skating. And so she just needed to get back to the gym. We make excuses for a lot of things. So she was admitted to the cardiology floor for 10 days at Brampton Civic. That was the first time. It wasn't the first time I'd heard the words pulmonary arterial hypertension, because I had heard about the disease before, but it was the first. But what I remembered when I heard it that week was that it wasn't good. I knew it wasn't good. And we were basically told that at the time that her only hope was a double lung transplant at the time. And then we were really lucky. I think maybe it was because she was so severe that it really only took 2 months to get an appointment with the PH clinic in the Toronto General Hospital. So she was really, really lucky. But we have patients that can wait like 6 years, 7 years. Asthma is a really big one. Women, PAH, the rare form of PH, affects women of childbearing age. That's the biggest cohort for this particular part of a segment of the disease, the rare form of the disease. And it's really unfortunate because when women go to see their family doctor because they're feeling a shortness of breath, or they're having trouble, they're really tired, what they get usually is, oh, you're a new mom, so don't worry about it, it happens to everybody, it'll pass. And when it doesn't pass after a year or so, then they think, they start looking at things like asthma and those kinds of things. So sometimes it takes a really long time to get diagnosed, and you can go from doctor to doctor too. Again, we were really lucky, and I'm just so appreciative of the fact that we were.
Yeah, no, she was a fascinating guest to have. That I think that was something that ran through a lot of our interviews this year, was the patient perspective. I'm really thrilled to see that it is becoming a bigger part of the conversation, especially around market access. How soon do you get it? How broad is it? Is it different for different diseases, like rare diseases that Jones organization is advocating on behalf of? I think that's a conversation that's been in the periphery and now is coming to the center. And at our CAPT meeting this past October, we saw that every panel had a patient advocate on to speak on behalf of different patients, and bring that perspective, irrespective of what topic was being discussed. So I think that was a great conversation that we had with her. Joan's always wonderful to have on, actually a good friend of the podcast. When I look back, actually, my favorite was Catalina, who's the Chief Scientific Officer for Genome Canada. She gave us her experience. So this is a patient experience directly, and this is not just a patient, but this is someone who works within our field, who is a scientist in the area of genomics of cancer, right? So, and then had that firsthand experience of being diagnosed with breast cancer and going through the stages of, how do I access all the testing? Is it covered? What is the value of the different types of tests? How do I use that information? How's my doctor going to use that information? So she really covered the bases on what it was like going through that experience, and not just as a sort of a layperson, but as a scientist. I think for me, the question that I still had for her, and actually I didn't actually even do that questioning, but yourself and Susan McNamara, our chief operating officer, did, and it was actually a great discussion. But the question I would have wanted to hear was, do we have enough people to help interpret all of this data that can potentially be generated, right? So we have genomics, whether they're panels, whether potentially they're whole genomes. You can look at somatic changes or hereditary changes, basically. So all of these different potential ways of gleaning information on how do we treat this, whether it's from a drug perspective or from a strategy perspective, so radiotherapy, surgery, you name it. Do we have enough people who can actually interpret and then counsel the patient? I think that for me is the big question. Or are we just further ahead on the science than we are on the infrastructure to utilize that science?
When I first got the diagnosis, because I come from the world of genomics, my initial thing was that I contact the people that are leading an initiative here in BC that's called the Personalized Oncogenomics Initiative, POG, P-O-G. So the Personalized Oncogenomics is basically doing full genome sequencing. So the 3 billion letters of the genome, they read the 3 billion letters of your tumor, and they read the 3 billion letters of your blood and compare that and see what mutations are there. So this is basically, you get the entire book of, the entire reading of the encyclopedia of your tumor. And that's kind of the best of the best of the best. And when I ask, I remember, the specialist or the person that's working in that project told me, like, I have good news and bad news for you. The good news is your tumor is too early. So you were catched, too early. Bad news, because I'm stage 2B, which is, I have a lump in my breast. I have lymph nodes, but I don't have, the lump is not too big and I don't have many lymph nodes. So with that, I say it's too early. That's the good news for you because you're not, your tumor is not too advanced. Bad news is we cannot do the sequencing on your tumor because we only sequence people that are stage 4. So good news, bad news. So going back to your question, Lester, so that's what you do in the tumor. And then you can also look at the genes in your blood. And that you don't need a sample of your tumor, but you need just a simple blood sample. And for that blood, you will look at what we call the hereditary cancer genes. So the genes you have in your body, in your constitutional, we call it constitutional DNA, and what you have in your body as genes that give you more susceptibility to uh, just have cancer. And those typically you inherit from your parents. They come and run in families, and that's why it's important for you to maybe know if there's other cancer cases in your family, and that will have implications also in your offspring if you have kids or your nephews or your family overall, brothers, sisters, all that. So that in my case here in Canada, I got the Oncotype DX, which is basically the profiling of the tumor. That was part of the standard of care. So I managed in a way, I started asking the oncologist, and I will answer your question, Susan, in a bit on how, what I recommend for patients and how to approach these. But I basically started asking the oncologist, and she told me, oh, you can enter a clinical trial. I signed, all the paperwork, enter a clinical trial, and got the profiling of my tumor with a test that's called Oncotype DX. But there are many others, Mama Print, others that have slightly different functions. But at the end, what they do is guide, refine your diagnosis and guide your treatment. In my case, just also, for the little story, the Oncotype DX, the score, when I was I was reading what is the score, how you classify that. Say if you got a score of 25 or less, you don't need chemotherapy. If you get a score of 25 or more, you need chemotherapy. So imagine you get a genetic test that guides your clinician, your oncologist, to decide if you need chemotherapy or not. So women that will have less than 25, forget it. This is great. This is the best news ever. You don't need chemotherapy. You can go from surgery to radiotherapy, bang, bang, really. You don't have to go through all the hassle. And you save money, if we think about, save money to the healthcare system, but also save you as a patient all the side effects and horrible things that, chemotherapy is great. Yeah, kills your tumor, but it's also super hard on your body and your mind and everything. So having that opportunity to really save some women from that, I think is brilliant. In my case, my score, I just laughed because I was, life is what it is, but my score was 26. So not 25, not 25, I was 26. I got my test before I went to see the oncologist. So I had time to reflect, and I was like thinking maybe, 26 is really close to 25, and maybe I will just go without chemotherapy. But sure enough, I went and my oncologist saying, no, I think we need to be, 100% here.
Yeah.
We're going to go with chemotherapy. It's 26. And we have other indications. Your lymph node was very big, whatever, many other, of course, because nothing is interpreted, in isolation. Everything makes part of your whole story and your clinical story. And that's why also, when we think about, well, I'll get back to the patient empowerment, but I'll add one thing here, is that test, again, was critical to define if I have chemo or not. Bad news for me, I had to get chemotherapy. But then when I asked the doctor, can I get, as I call the Angelina Jolie test, the BRCA1, BRCA2, the hereditary cancer panel that tells me, if this runs in my family, she basically saying, no, this is not covered by the healthcare system because you don't have any sisters, any close relatives, your mom or your aunts. Nobody in your family has breast cancer. You are, just a single case. So in that case, there is no indication, and the healthcare system will not cover the test for you. But me being, a scientist, a genomicist, I say, well, I really want to know that. She gave me the option to pay it out of pocket. So I enrolled and I paid, and I did it with a company actually in the US, which is quite sad because we have lots of capabilities here to do that. We should be able to do the hereditary cancer panel in Canada. Why? And that's another debate that we can spend 1 hour on. But yeah, I sent my sample to the US, got my results. Luckily, and good news, I didn't have any hereditary cancer genes, so no worries for my family. And it was good there. But in some cases, you have to navigate that piece of what is covered, what is not covered, and how you can try and get access. And one thing I would say for the patients, Susan, is that sometimes people get really scared and stressed because the complexity, oh, what is this genomic profiling? What type of test? What do I need to get? And I always say, you don't need to be, you don't need to have a PhD. You don't need to be a genomicist. You just need to really, at a high level, be aware that they can do an analysis of the DNA of your tumor. They can do an analysis of the DNA of your blood. And that can help you really guide your diagnosis and your treatment.
Yeah, no, that was a fascinating, not a fascinating conversation. Obviously, Colleen is an amazing person, but also I would love to follow up with her and have her back on the podcast. Well, I mean, we'd love to have everyone back on the podcast, but Catalina specifically from the perspective that she's now returned back to work after her diagnoses and her treatment. So it'd be interesting to hear her thoughts around her conversations now as the chief scientific officer of Genome Canada. So that's going to be very, very interesting. Because she's promised, she said, "Oh, things are going to change, Lester." She said that, so I wonder what types of changes she would have made already now.
I'd love to see that for sure.
And okay, last but not least, so we obviously had some great guests on, incredible conversations. Very, very been fortunate. People have been so supportive of our podcast, which has really evolved into something maybe more than what we originally thought. Now it's very much more broader from a healthcare perspective, but it's really healthcare and data and the intersection between the two, and why it's important for everyone, right? Really, the different stakeholders in the entire ecosystem. So for maybe next year, what do you think, Kostas? What is something you would do next year? What is something we should do next year that we haven't done yet this year?
Yeah, so I think there are two things. I think the first thing, we know that there is an election coming up, right? So I would love to have some of the candidates come onto our podcast and talk about where in their priority is cancer, and I think life sciences more, from a bigger picture. Because I don't think that that's really part of the conversation right now. There's obviously a lot to talk about that is meaningful to people, but I think from our perspective as researchers, as representatives of the sort of the cancer ecosystem, I would love to hear people's thoughts on how they are going to change policy, or if it's even on their radar, because I'm not sure that it is. To your earlier point, that budget doesn't get allocated if there isn't a voice in their ear saying, hey, you might want to look at spending a little bit of your cash over here. So I think that's one big one that I'd love to see. The second is actually a very specific individual. And I think we talked about this sort of offline. I would love to see Robert Kennedy. I'd love to have him on the podcast. And there's I think a really important reason for it. as much as people may uh, refuse to acknowledge, the U.S. definitely drives policy around R&D, around what products get tested, what gets approved, what it gets actually paid for. It is sort of the first mover across all of these domains. So with a huge change coming to healthcare in the United States, potentially, no one's been approved yet, but let's assume that some of these folks go through. You have to look at their very different approaches and ideas around healthcare and say, how is that going to impact Canada? And I think life sciences more broadly around the world. So I would love to have someone like a Robert Kennedy on to help us walk through what the plans are in the next year or 2 or 4 to change the life science landscape.
You know, that actually, that's amazing. Actually, I had a little bit of an overlapping one, but I've heard Justin, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on other podcasts, and unfortunately, it's an American podcast. Not that there's anything wrong with these these other podcasts. I think it was one that was based in New York. So he definitely is open to joining podcasts. Hopefully, we can get a couple candidates himself, others such as the Conservative candidate as well, Pierre Poilievre. And others, but the one that, of course, having Robert Kennedy on, we're open to people coming on from all different countries. But yeah, WF, of course, our partners down south or neighbors down south are incredibly important for, obviously, our culture wise, from just a trade policy, economics wise. So yeah, absolutely. So I did have an overlapping one for myself next year. I would have liked to see some international guests, so that's why I wrote. So I didn't have any particular person. I just wrote international guests would be interesting to see how other people do in other countries. I thought that would have been an interesting perspective that could be that other Canadians can see. And then the other one I thought would be interesting would be to have, because by and large, most of these conversations we have with people, we by and large agree with them, and there isn't it's not contentious in any way. And it's not that I want to make it contentious, but it would be interesting to get people on the podcast, and maybe something along the lines of 2 individuals who may have differing views of a specific topic. Like I would say maybe value-based care is interesting. Everyone keeps on talking about how great value-based care is. I mean, Eva and others have been real huge proponents of it, but we still don't do it. So why not? So there must be someone out there that believes that is not the right thing to do, and we shouldn't change things because there's these other things that we haven't thought about that could be huge issues. So I would love to hear different perspectives simultaneously, because I think that would be interesting, but still somehow make it so that it's not like, I don't want it to be a debate or something just who wins the argument, but a conversation. That to me would be very interesting if we can pull something off like that.
Yeah, that's, if you think about it, it's one of the things that I think Canadians do a little bit better, or traditionally have done a bit better, which is the ability to actually have a conversation. I don't know if everyone would agree that we're still in that environment, but for us, certainly, I think we would love to be able to just have those conversations. Like you don't advance if you are not learning from someone or being challenged and having your assumptions challenged. And I don't think we do better without examining our own assumptions and figuring out, okay, should I change those? Because maybe I didn't consider this or that. So for sure, I think it would be great to have some differing opinions and really let people sort of think about what the best approach is or what a better approach. Because I don't know if we're going to get to best overnight, but how can we incrementally improve and take what others have done and apply it to our health system?
Yeah, well, that's great. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining in and tuning in today. This has been a great conversation as usual. It's finally we get to do this in person, so hopefully everyone likes this out there. This is the first time we had to set up this. Hopefully there aren't too many technical issues, and we'll try to fix it. And of course, if you have comments and any suggestions, feel free to write them down below. Comment, like, and subscribe. But before we jump off, I know we have some big news from Exactus coming up, and just want to ask everyone to maybe stay tuned for that as well. So with that, thanks a lot, everyone, for tuning in. Happy holidays to everyone, and hopefully we have more exciting, interesting conversations coming in the new year.
Yeah. Happy holidays, everyone. We'll see you next year.